Oh, hello, you've come back. Thank you very much for the third of these talks on retro philosophy. And our subject today is going to be time, and that hopefully is going to help explain the retro bit a little bit. Now, if you remember, in the first talk, we started off by talking about starting with what we know and building towards the truth. And of course, that's what the pre-Socratics did, so that's all pretty good. And then in the second talk, we starting off with what we know being expressed in numbers or scientifically, then building to a narrative to a new truth. And again, there's nothing new there. The pre-Socratics did it. Aristotle, with his knowledge of maths and of Egyptian civilization, was bang up to date. The Islamic philosophers developing maths into algebra, base zero, incredible observations of the sky. Descartes was a mathematician and a scientist first, only really did his philosophy to get the other stuff through, and so we go on. So when I want to factor in time, it's a bit tricky really, because nobody really knows what time is. We've got an inkling of what gravity is. It's a distortion of space-time caused by matter, but time, not the first clue. Some clever people will come along and solve it one day. But let's start off with old Aristotle and his definition of time being like an arrow. And I think if Aristotle were alive today, he'd be a bit bewildered by our desire to keep on going back and interrogating him with the dialectic, having a conversation with the past. I think he'd understand it in relation to theology, where Holy Scripture doesn't change, so it makes sense to see what insights you can get from those books. But for Aristotle, he wouldn't really see the distinction between science and philosophy. So his first inkling would be to get up to speed with old Descartes and Newton and what have you, and then go off and have a chat with Stephen Hawking about the latest stuff. It's not what would we say to Aristotle, it's what would Aristotle say if he were alive today. So the dialectic doesn't seem to me to be a good way of proceeding, and I'll illustrate that with talking about Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton, genius that he was, wrote his principal work, the Principia, in as difficult a language as he could possibly make it, to put off the likes of me oiks. I'd much prefer looking at an A-level textbook where it's all clearly laid out. And the other thing about Newton was that he was an alchemist, spent most of his time turning his wheat into gold. And you know what? Just not interested in all that stuff. It was wrong then and it's wrong now, okay? So you need to be relevant. You need to think, what is it that Aristotle would say if he were alive today? That's the first thing on time. The second thing on time, well, is I guess what I would call computer time. And by that, I mean, if you look at physicists and their equations, they kind of work kind of both ways. Like our computers do, they can run the computer model backwards or forwards to the Big Bang and forwards to the end of the universe and what have you. So what can we do? We can look back to where we've come from, but what can we do that the physicists can't do? Well, we can do two important things. The first thing is, there's always impossibilities. You know, something from nothing doesn't sound right. If you look at biology, for example, and Dawkins' genius work on the selfish gene, he can explain evolution, but he can't explain where DNA came from in the first place, bubbling out the primeval brew. He's trying to, saying it might have come out of clay, but that's as insulting to the religious people as his views are to them. And even if you move forward, all the complex life came from one sort of bacteria eating another sort of bacteria. It's as likely as a tiger eating me and my brain being incorporated and working inside the tiger. So not only can we look back, but we can look back to the starts and the origins. I went to a talk at Cambridge. There were three distinguished academics talking about the Big Bang, talking about the complex life coming together, and talking about consciousness first developing. All fascinating talks, all started off with an impossibility, and at no point had they conferred together to see if there was any commonality between what had gone on behind. So the next point of retrophilosophy is not just to look forwards and to look backwards in time, but to highlight and distinguish the impossibilities, the disruptions, the origins, and then to link the different narratives together, the different strands together. Okay, and then the third one is, well, about time. And some people say that time is just an illusion and it's just, I don't know, a measure of change. Not sure about that, but what I do know is that life has changed unrecognisably for my mum. Born on a Welsh hill farm, life would have been recognisable to a Roman soldier, just the same. Now, she's a whiz on her iPhone, and iPhone is a computer. It's computing power doubling every 2 years. That's my kind of Moore's law. It's linked to all the other computers around the world, so that she has all of human knowledge at her fingertips, and she can speak to whoever she wants to, whenever she wants to. So, just an astonishing thing that shows the progress that we've made. Exponential growth in our knowledge and capabilities. Now, we use the word exponential a lot, but I just want to stop and stress this word because I want to give you an example, the one that we all know. We've all seen pictures of a human cell being fertilized and then splitting and then doubling again and doubling again and doubling again. That's exponential growth. Ends up with me. I've got 40 trillion cells in me. That's 4 with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 noughts. That's 40 million millions. That's exponential growth for you. And we're just starting. So we probably know more now in the last 50 years than the 50,000 years before. In the next 50 years, we'll know 1,000 times more. And then 50 years after that, 1,000,000 times more. We're getting an astonishing amount of information and an astonishing growing capability. But where does this leave the retro-philosopher? Well, with increased knowledge comes increased complexity, the scientists working in their silos. It's the job of the retro-philosopher not just to link the narratives, but to see simplicity within all this complexity, to see the pictures that lie behind. Yes, we know that nature's answers are elegant and simple. If we build all these narratives together, look for the simplicity, we can start to say this is what it could be like. I'm not saying we'll come up with the answer now, but we come up with a methodology for coming up with the answer that, as we plug more and more information, will ultimately give us the answer. So retro-philosophy is a philosophical method to stand side by side with the scientific method, to get philosophy from underneath science, where it's been since Descartes, and up to being an equal partner, not obsessed with the past and what Plato said, but making sense of the complexity that we now have. I think that's about it. Stay tuned for the next time. Bye-bye.